Welcome everyone, my name is Colleen Pouliot. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Marty M. Taylor. So please welcome her. Marty, would you come up, please? Oh, okay. Let me tell you first a little bit about her background then. She's from Edmonton, Alberta. And we sign Alberta with an A hand shape on the non-dominant hand. Now, actually, Marty grew up in the United States. She grew up in Seattle, Washington. And she did her interpreter training in 1976 in the interpreter training program at Seattle Community College. And that led her to where she is today. She graduated with an AAS degree from Seattle Community College and then transferred to CSUN in California in Northridge. She studied for her Bachelor's of Science degree in interpreting at CSUN and then worked teaching American Sign Language in various places in the Los Angeles area. From there, she went to Alberta, Canada, and established an interpreter training program where she's been the director for the past 5 years. While in Alberta, she studied for her PhD and now does independent research work. She's researched interpreting from English to ASL, which she has published, and she's also received federal grants to now complete her studies by studying ASL to English interpretation. So please welcome Marty Taylor. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have 30 seconds, okay. Hello, everybody. Are you awake? Come on, show me that you're awake. A little head nodding, please. Thank you. That's a little better. Now, how many of you are hearing? Would you mind raising your hand, please? Oh, how many deaf people here today? All down here, for the most part. Of course, all the deaf people are sitting in the front where they can see me better. So how many of you have been involved in research in the past? Anyone? One? We only have one researcher in the audience today, none others. All right. How many of you are from New York? Okay. This is an interesting group we have here today. This is my first time here at NTID, and I've been very impressed with what I've seen here today. I've had a tour of the buildings. It's quite a nice facility that you have here. Very cool. You're doing fine. As some of you probably know, I've been in Canada for the last 13 years. And because of that exposure, my sign language usage has changed over time. And I may sign something today that you're unfamiliar with because it's a Canadian sign. So if that happens, please feel free to interrupt me and get clarification. This talk I'm going to give today is part of a 3-part series. That series is called ASL in the Academy, and it's a research-based presentation. So I'm the 4th speaker in this series of ASL in the Academy. And I've done my interpreting research. Other people have done ASL research, but it's very clear, despite the wonderful presentations that we had, that we need a lot more research in this area. I'm wondering if people feel that there are enough interpreters out in the field working, or if there's a need for more. I see a lot of heads nodding when I ask if there's a need for more. Do you think the interpreters, by and large, have a competent skill level, or do you feel that the skills need to be improved? I see people responding to both. I would agree. And I've done research on this topic, and during that research process, I viewed a lot of interpreters' work, some who were certified, some who had just recently graduated from programs, some with a lot of experience, some with not very much experience. I've seen some of the top interpreters and some of the newest baby interpreters, and I would agree with your observations that we still have a long way to go. Well, recognizing that we have a long way to go leads us to the question of how do we get there? I'm going to give a 1-hour presentation, or actually at this point a little bit less than an hour, about my research findings. And then after I talk about my findings, I'll talk about where we go from here. Now, this talk could be a much longer talk, but I'll condense what I have to say today into the time we have allowed. As you can see, my goal is on the overhead here. And that's something that we really want, but at the same time it's very difficult. And we need to define steps of how we can get to that goal. But this is the overall goal that we're working with. Because I'm an interpreter myself and I face the challenges of trying to improve my own skills, it really led me to the development of this goal. I also saw the needs of other interpreters to improve. I'm an educator as well, and we don't really have curriculum that will really help us get to where we're going. We have some excellent things that people have developed, and I've developed my own, and I borrow from other interpreter trainers, and we do share with one another, but at the same time, there's something missing. It's not enough. And when we look at a new interpreter who goes out into the field and works for the time in the beginning, we see that it's not as bad as it was in the old days, and things have improved, but that new interpreter faces many hardships and trial by fire before they gain enough experience to become a certified interpreter. As a teacher, I wondered what I could do to help the beginning interpreter be ready to go out into the field. I mean, we have curriculums that look very nice on paper. We have materials that we use. But where's the curriculum that we really need? And that's a frustration that I've felt. Also for the new interpreter educator, where do you develop those curriculums? So that's when I started to realize that the best thing that I could give to my field is some research. For people starting off as beginning interpreter educators, there's quite a large learning curve. There's a lot to develop.
They're just graduated interpreters. They may be good, but they're not yet.
Oftentimes, these people are interpreters who are relatively recent graduates themselves and may lack the skill and knowledge and expertise of years of work that would help them in their teaching. Let me give you some examples. Let's talk about the RID certification test and the Canadian equivalent AVLIC, the Association of Visual Language Interpreters of Canada, and our acronym for that is AVLIC. These two groups both certify interpreters. People taking the RID exam have a passing rate of about 50%. Now, 50% also fail. That means so it's a 50-50 proposition. For the AVLIC certification test, for the number of applicants who test, approximately 20% pass. That means that there's an 80% failure rate. Sometimes, one year, for example, the rate was even lower, as low as 7%. I mean, think of the failure rate. Does that mean that the skill of interpreters is different from country to country, or does that mean the tests are different? And those are important questions. When interpreters take the test, often they are only given pass-fail information, and they don't get diagnostic information that will help them work on their skills to be ready to retest and pass the test. And I wanted to help that process, to help interpreters have a system of diagnosing their work to see where they need to improve their skill. Oftentimes in our communities, we see interpreters who are good interpreters, and they may have a state exam that they've taken, or they may be popular because, well, maybe not popular, but, they may be frequently a preferred interpreter. And sometimes there are screening tests that we see. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But those are the ways that we evaluate interpreters. And so we see this huge inconsistency, the RID test, the AVLIC test, these state screenings, as well as employment screenings. And we need some help for consistency in our field. Now, you're probably all familiar with Dennis Coakley and Betty Kalanimis. These two people have developed wonderful models for interpreting and process of interpreting. But both of them assume that interpreters have language fluency in both languages, English and ASL. So the model itself is good. But when you look at interpreters, I don't see the ASL fluency, and I think the model is for a person with advanced skill in American Sign Language. So if we back up and start to build ASL fluency, then the models are really helpful and help us make the transition between the two languages. At any rate, we know that we have many problems in our field, and research is an important way that we can address those deficiencies. Now, my research was designed to be applicable both in the United States and in Canada. So when we talk about ASL, I'm talking about ASL on a continuum. Most of the time, we tend to be probably on one end of that continuum. And in the AVLIC certification, if a person can both transliterate and interpret, then they can pass. But RID has separated those into two different skills. And now, of course, we're working with the NAD to change that. But the way that it's been in recent years is the test is split into two portions, one for interpreting and one for transliterating. You can pass one and fail the other. You can pass both, you can fail both, but you can pass only one and still be certified. And so there's an idea that perhaps we should work towards having both included. Because when we meet a deaf person, we base our target language on what that person's needs are, and our skills should cover a range. Is everyone able to hear the voice interpreter all right? Everybody can hear? Great, thanks. I'm getting head nods. My goal was to do a diagnostic evaluation and develop a diagnostic tool, something that interpreters could use to take a look at their work and how they need to improve. The first item, of course, is the reason that we need the diagnostic, and that's something that's an absolute must. The goal here is to take an interpreted message and compare it with the spoken English and see if there's message equivalency. Is the interpreted message richer than the original English message, or are there errors and deletions? So when we look at that interpreted message, we want to be able to analyze it to see what's there and what's not there. Also, we want to find the difference between the new novice interpreter and the experienced interpreter, and to have some comparisons and to be able to define what the difference is between these two skill levels. And if someone has specific skills, they can be termed a qualified interpreter, and if they don't have those skills, if they're new or maybe have a little bit of experience but are still relatively novices, or they may lack some ASL skills, which we sometimes see, not often, of course, but then they can find out what they need to work on and work towards that skill level. There's a lot of literature written about ASL. Ted Sapala and his brother Sam Sapala have done some good research on ASL, and Ben Bahan as well, and Chris Monikowski here from NTID. Betsy Winston has also done research, and I took from their work, and I read their work and did literature review, and then looked at what the differences were in these interpreters. I saw interpreters both live and on videotape. I used Canadian interpreters and United States interpreters, and looked at a volume of material of interpretations. I borrowed the AVLIC videotapes and looked at them, and of course all of that is confidential, but I was still able to use it because once the interpreters take their exam and either pass or fail, I was able to look at the tapes, and I asked each individual interpreter for permission before I used those tapes. So I had a volume of information to work from, and it was very rich. Some interpreters were obviously quite skilled, others were not, and so I started to try to classify them, and within these classifications still we saw a great variety. And I started to document the different skills that I saw within these two classifications. And also at this point I started to look at where errors occurred. And I would have preferred to focus only on skills, but I found myself needing to focus on errors. The reason being that errors show us what we need to fix. So my research really includes both skills and errors. What I saw from the videotapes was that most of the problems were with language skills, ASL problems, vocabulary problems, not with the interpreting process itself. You know, AVLIC test differs from RID tests in that first you have to pass an ASL test. And you know, in RID, the videotape is given first to the deaf rater and is checked for ASL competency, and then is given to the hearing rater to see if English is competency, and then the interpretation is evaluated. And so we know that we have the problem of not enough ASL skill, language skill in interpreters. Is it hot in here, or is it just me? Mind if I take my jacket off? Now, when we look at all the information that we have about skills, about errors, and all the data that I had to work with. It was a little bit daunting of a task, but I decided after looking at all this that I could categorize it into two groups. Knowledge lean skills, meaning skills that are easy to learn in some ways. For example, finger spelling. It's quite simple for someone to acquire basic finger spelling skills. And then, you may see some people who have difficulty, but most people can pretty easily learn a finger spelling system. And that also includes things like numbers, which people are able to pick up pretty quickly. But other aspects of ASL, like grammar, vocabulary in some instances, and other things are harder to pick up and acquire, and those would be called knowledge-rich skills. And these knowledge-rich skills, like inflection, like the grammar and other aspects I mentioned, really are the most important framework of the interpretation, and these other elements come in more occasionally, whereas the knowledge-rich is there consistently throughout the interpretation. Now, I know here in Rochester you have the heritage of the Rochester method and a lot of fingerspelling, but putting that aside, I think we'll agree that most interpretation uses the knowledge-rich skills throughout.
All of the skills we're able to put into these variety of classifications. The knowledge lean skills are at the top, whereas the knowledge rich skills are listed at the bottom. This last item, entitled Composure and Appearance, is what the interpreter looks like. Some people might call it lean, other people might classify it as rich, but if I'm the interpreter, I need to look well throughout the entire interpretation. So the interpretation goes from beginning to end. That's why I listed it under knowledge rich. The skills I've put down are observable skills. We also match these skills with the observable errors. Finger spelling I will use as an example. Fingerspelling can be used as emphasis. For example, if an interpreter tends to be repeating a specific word like fingerspelling but this, but that, but the other thing, that is one use of it. If it's used again, then they cannot use the fingerspelled but sign to emphasize a concept later. So the interpreter needs to learn how to use fingerspelling for emphasis in ASL. The first sentence shows the skill, and then the bulleted list underneath shows the errors that are likely to occur with that skill. I've also expanded on definitions for each of the skills. I felt that this information that was presented was not enough. It was limited. second example, which is more complex and richer. This is an example of a knowledge-rich skill. Altogether, I identified 59 separate skills with possible errors for each. I categorized them from knowledge lean to knowledge rich in 8 different categories. Next, I sat down and reviewed these skills with a panel of other experts, interpreters who were certified, both deaf and hearing people who had an opinion on my research. There were 17 deaf and non-deaf Canadian experts that I shared my research with. I handed out a evaluation form to each of the individuals. I asked them to read through my work, to comment on the clarity of it and the comprehension of it. I asked them if they wanted to have any clarification, that would be fine. And I reviewed the work with them. When I was done with the discussion with the group in Canada, after I received their feedback, it was interesting. And as you know or may know, that the feedback from the deaf people was different from the feedback from the non-deaf people. For example, some of the deaf people asked me to eliminate the error of fingerspelling too fast. They said that that was not necessary. However, another deaf person said, no, that's exactly true. Some interpreters do fingerspell too fast. It should be classified as an error. So that's a prime example of, for example, my name is Marty. If I fingerspell it too fast, people may misread it and think that my name is Mary. If I fingerspell my name a little slowly, then people can pick up the T and get Marty. So the point is, you need to fingerspell it just like in spoken English. If there's a new word or a new concept, a spoken English person will voice it or pause before and after to emphasize the word, and fingerspelling likewise needs to be slowed down for new concept words or specific names in order for the receiver to receive the message. So this one deaf expert felt that that was an error. Another deaf person also said that when an interpreter fingerspells too slow for emphasis, it looks like they are belittling the deaf viewer and the deaf audience recipient. Now, if the entire panel agreed that we should remove a skill, of course I removed it. But if there was a disagreement among the opinions, I tended to keep that skill on the list. After this panel review, I wrote a paragraph, a definition for each of the skills that I have contained in my research. Everyone read this overhead. Seems clear. So again, we have the skill, the definition, and then a short commentary on the errors. Others will just have the skill listed in a single sentence with bulleted This was a lot of work. One skill did not take 1 minute. Sometimes I'd analyze it for 20 minutes or so, and this is each individual skill. Again, as I said, there were two groups of interpreters. Canadians looked at this tool and evaluated it. There were also videotapes that were used. Videotapes of interpreters who were certified, experienced, and videotapes of non-certified interpreters who had a few years of experience.
I thought she said one of each. No. Yeah, one of certified, one not certified.
We looked at the videotape of the certified and compared the certified interpreter to the non-certified interpreter, keeping these skills in mind in order to diagnose and analyze their work.
She's also saying it was consistent across the panel. They achieved consistency.
Some of the feedback when looking at the videotapes would be, for example, the eye gaze was incorrect, or every time that the interpreter interpreted a specific skill, it was always off the mark. So there were a variety of opinions expressed with this review.
She's talking about the errors and the agreement, the amount of agreement between the panel members. I can look at the amount of errors. Thanks. How to classify those areas.
We looked at the skills and we decided, is a skill correct or is it incorrect? Is it accurate or inaccurate? For each error, there were two things. We had to decide if this error happened frequently or if it happened infrequently. If it happened frequently, that was important. If it happened infrequently, we just might remind the interpreter or let the interpreter know. The second thing we looked for was the severity of the error. How bad was the error? Did the interpretation deviate from the English text, or was it slightly off the mark? If it was slightly bothersome, but the audience could understand equally as well as the non-deaf audience could understand the English text, that was not considered a severe error. Now, let me give you an example of an interpreter who used a frequent error, like fixing her hair or touching her hair often, or adjusting her eyeglasses on her face. That, if it happens too often, might be bothersome. However, the information conveyed is accurate. It's not deviating from the text. Now, it's important to note the difference. Also, it's important to know the difference between frequency of error and severity of error. Again, if an interpreter is using an error frequently, like sticking their hand in their ear, that might influence the information coming out and bother the audience, and then that might be classified as severe error. Now, we had the Canadian panel review this. And then when I was done with my Canadian review, it was time to go to the U.S. experts and review with them, and I got very nervous. I handed out the same materials. I wasn't sure if they liked the materials, like my research, think it was bad, think it was good. I picked the Los Angeles area in California. I picked that because there were interpreters I knew would be in the area. There were 7 interpreter educators there, and there were non-deaf educators, and I wanted them to be able to listen to the English source language and be able to compare it to the interpretation. Again, I handed out the 59 skills. We asked for feedback. We discussed the errors, again, categorizing them errors of frequency versus errors of severity. There's a lot of work for that panel of experts that I had engaged. And again, individually, we didn't have an open discussion, but individually in the own room, this was finished, we got together back in a group and decided that we could use the information. This final discussion took approximately 2 hours, and we decided that the 59 skills were appropriate. They felt that these skills could help the interpreters. There were comments and scores that would be useful to interpreter in their skill development, as well as interpreter educators in their curriculum development, which is something that I'm very interested in. When I see a new instructor coming into the interpreting field, I like to be able to hand them a text or some kind of resource that they can pull from in order to do their teaching. And just as in the engineering field, you go into an engineering field, they have a code book that needs to be followed. Of course, these texts and curricula are revised, but if we could have this package ready, that would be wonderful. In the interpreting education field, we don't have these texts as of yet. To each of the 59 skills, again, with this United States group, it was a review board, I wanted to see their answers if the errors in the discussions on the videotapes, if everyone would agree on the errors or disagree. And I was curious as to seeing what my findings would be. Again, there were 7 people from California. I wanted 5 to agree. That was my goal. I could use, if 4 agreed, 4 would be the majority in that group, and that would validate my findings. However, my purpose and my want was to have 5 people agree with my findings in order to me to feel that it was standard. This is one of the skills. There was not consistent agreement. It was usually 50-50. Some would say yes, others would say no. About the skill itself. If the skill was appropriate to be in the set or not. So 64%, 54%, I was not happy with those numbers. However, when we actually diagnosed the skills, or actually diagnosed the errors of the interpreting samples, again using these 5 A, B, and C, these possible errors, the agreement across or about the errors increased. 95% agreement on the interpretation. On the interpretation, the errors in the interpretation. So I liked the number, the increase in the agreement and the agreement among those raters. 77% is fine. We're talking about training people and using this as a tool to diagnose. 77% is an adequate number of agreement. Also, when we're discussing knowledge lean and knowledge rich skills, there was more agreement among the raters when we were discussing knowledge lean skills such as finger spelling and numbers. However, when we moved in the categories in the knowledge rich area, like grammar and interpretation, the agreement was not as high and opinions varied, which means that we as a field need to learn how to identify the skills that are knowledge rich so we can identify the interpreter who is using the facial grammar. And we have had help from people who are deaf native signers who tell us summarize by saying this is a diagnostic tool that can be used. Sorry, it's illegible. But this workbook can be used by individual interpreters to improve their skills. I feel that this can be used as well because it's a tool that can be used in a couple of hours. The tool can also be used as a curriculum development guide. It can be used by interpreters who are experienced in the field, who are considered experts, as well as interpreters who are novices. For the future, I feel we need more information, we need more feedback. The 7 people in California gave me their feedback, but I need more people who use this tool to give me feedback, and the more feedback I hear, the more confident I will be in the tool. Through my research, we found that the key concern is competence at ASL, and as we move towards increasing our competency and our bilingual approach to the job, we also know that we have Betty Kalanimis and Dennis Coakley's models that we can rely on to help us in our work. However, there are still gaps in our field regarding research. We need more research in our field, so I encourage any researcher in the audience to start their research and to fill in these gaps so that we can have a complete, cohesive body of research on which we can use. I've discussed knowledge lean and knowledge rich skills. We know that we can teach ASL. We have sequences that we teach our students in, and maybe we need to look at these sequences again to decide which things should be taught first, which things should be taught second, and which things should be taught third, rather than teaching them in the order we've been teaching them in, and finding that there's information, valuable information being missed in the basic courses that should have been covered, and people need to go back and relearn later. Now, as I said, my research findings found 59 different skills, from the knowledge lean to the knowledge rich. In my findings of the 59 skills, I didn't want this to be a waste of my time. I wanted AVLIC and RID to be able to use this and to be able to pick maybe 2 or 3 specific skills that all of the best and experienced and what we would call expert interpreters have. If we could identify these specific skills, then we'd be able to identify these expert interpreters without having to have them go through a battery of tests in order to prove their competence. I finished my research in 1993. In 1994, I began researching on the second phase of my research, that is ASL to English interpretation. I've been in this process for almost 3 years, and hopefully I will finish this in the fall. I'm hoping, I say, to finish this in the fall. Now, this book is not for everyone. It's for people who can use it and can use the information it contains. For the people who can use it, like interpreters, it's great. Now, this is my written book. It is not a diagnostic tool, but it's got information on each of the 59 skills, definitions, and errors. And hopefully in the future, I will have another tool, as well as have a book that incorporates both. That's what I'm hoping. I'd like to thank the people who gave me the money, the people on the federal level in Canada who granted me the money. It's from the Studies Research Council of Canada. That's SSHRCC. And they funded one of my studies, and they've also funded my second research endeavor. So I'd like to thank that council. I'd also like to thank the ASL Lecture Committee for arranging this presentation today. They did a wonderful job. I'd like to thank especially Bill Newell, who contacted me regularly through email. He answered every question I had. I'd like to thank Barbara Ray for giving me a tour of NTID this morning. I was quite impressed with it, as well as Colleen for introducing me this morning and joining me for breakfast this morning, Susan Fisher. Thank you all for your invitation, and great, have a good day.